Hi, welcome to Forza Monthly, live streaming a franchise. Today, we're going to talk about developing and producing Forza Monthly, a hosted live stream show that covers all the latest Forza gaming and franchise news. My name is Shay Goldenberg. I'm the media and broadcast producer here at Turn 10 Studios, developers of the Forza Motorsport Racing franchise, which is part of Xbox Game Studios and Microsoft. My team is responsible for creating all of the amazing trailers, screenshots, and other video content for the Forza franchise, as well as all of our live streams. I've been in the gaming industry for over 12 years, with 8 of those at Turn 10, as well as having taught students that have gone into the gaming space. I'm hoping that today you'll come away with a better understanding of what it takes to develop a rhythm of business live stream for a franchise, the considerations and challenges involved, as well as a proven set of guidelines that you can apply to your own game or franchise. But before we get started, let me provide a little bit of context. First, it's worth noting that the Forza franchise has grown considerably over the years. We went from initially developing just the Forza Motorsport titles to partnering with Playground Games in the UK to develop the Forza Horizon titles, to moving into the PC space with Forza Street, which will soon be launching on mobile. We have a robust esports program as well as numerous partner programs, and essentially we have 3 products in the global market right now. Historically, the franchise has focused marketing and PR support only on the major news beats. Now, this was true for most games out there, where it was all about customer acquisition, so when a game was announced or when a game was launched. But with more frequent game updates and news happening after a game was launched, we had to change focus to retention tactics and really looking at current players and the community. In 2017, Forza Motorsport 7 took a new approach to post-launch content updates. It was the studio's first product to offer live service gameplay updates after launch, so there was a lot of learning while trying to figure out the best way to talk about this with the community. In 2018, Forza Horizon 4 launched with a planned cadence of gameplay and content updates. So we went a step further with series updates every 4 weeks that had seasonal changes, events, car rewards, as well as expansions, and most recently, a new game mode called the Eliminator. Essentially, we needed a more frequent method of communicating Forza news and updates, as well as a more effective way to let the community know that we're listening to them. We needed to build a new communication muscle, and so we had some questions we had to ask. First, we wanted to think about what would be an engaging and effective way to provide the community with more frequent and contextual information. Well, if you know what this talk is about, then you know that the answer to that is live streaming. So we needed to think about what would be the benefits of live streaming over other methods of communication that we've used in the past. It allows for more nuanced, detailed, and intimate messaging, and really takes the best parts of the established forms of communication that we were already using, but added more entertaining and personable elements to them. But that wasn't the only benefit. We found that it was the primary manner in which our audience consumes media. So when we took a look at our target demographics and gamers in general, we found that in 2019, they watched almost 13 billion hours of live stream content, which absolutely blew our minds. Live stream content is easily digestible. It's available live, obviously, as well as on demand, and it establishes a presence for us in a rapidly growing and important space. So live streaming seemed like the way to go. That's what we wanted to do. And because of that, we then boom! Forza Monthly was born. Forza Monthly is a talk show style live stream that reveals the latest game content updates and other franchise news. It's studio driven and product focused and provides in-depth context for how and why features are developed, while also highlighting other beats for the franchise, such as our esports program and the partner activations we have with hundreds of car manufacturers as well as our other partner brands. The show features key members of the development teams and occasional special guests. This allows us to deliver contextual and genuine messaging straight from the team, not just a spokesperson. The people that are working on the updates actually get to talk about their efforts. It's also really cool for our community and the viewers to see some of the partners we work with, like professional drivers such as Tanner Faust and Von Gittin Jr., or when we released the LEGO expansion for Forza Horizon 4 and we were able to bring a LEGO Speed Champion designer onto the show. The show airs once a month to match the cadence of the game content updates, and it also facilitates a healthy news cycle. So the show's not too often or too infrequent, and it allows us to have a sufficient planning and pre-production period to put the show together. We can scale the level of production support to best align with the information and content. So we're not at the mercy of filling a certain amount of time or a certain amount of content. It's really about creating a great show that delivers important news at the right time. And so we had a sense for what this would be, but there were some considerations that we had to think about first. First, live streaming in 2018 was new territory for the Forza franchise. We were really just starting to think about what we could and should be doing in the live streaming space. Also, there wasn't much precedent in Xbox gaming for a franchise-level developer-led show. There aren't really many other gaming franchises like Forza out there, in the sense of having multiple products in the market at the same time that share an ethos and have some customer crossover. Because this was new for us, a culture shift was required to get the team and our leadership comfortable and acclimated to this type of communication. Announcing updates prior to release, talking to the devs about what was and wasn't working, and opening a dialogue with the community were all new approaches for us. That said, we knew that we were going to be able to leverage our existing expertise and proven processes for developing other types of media content and apply that to a live show. We had a great deal of experience with all sorts of franchise content being created, including game capture, live action interviews, behind the scenes pieces, esports broadcasts, and more. Of course, like with any new initiative, there were some lessons, so let's talk about a few of them. First, I'd like to talk about developing a run of show. For those of you not familiar, a run of show is a minute-by-minute outline of the show that includes all of the segments, topics, guest appearances, pre-recorded content, graphics, and other relevant notes. You can see an example of one right there. Now, I'm not going to discuss how a run of show is developed creatively, but more so the process that goes into making one. The main challenge that we had was collaborating and coordinating with key stakeholders across different teams and studios and time zones. Stakeholders for this included leadership from the product and program teams, our community team, people at the franchise level, our partner team, as well as marketing and PR. We needed to understand the updates for each product and program, as well as partnership news and other initiatives. So we had to connect with the Motorsport team and the Horizon team to determine what was important to discuss and show off in the game. The esports team was also looped in, as well as members of other teams for visibility, who each had awareness for their area of focus and could call out potential opportunities. We initially tried to have inclusive meetings with all key stakeholders, but scheduling challenges became a big roadblock for us pretty quickly. At first, we thought there would be a benefit to discussing all of the show topics and talking points with everyone in the room at the same time, because certain stakeholders were useful to have involved in all discussions, such as the folks from our partner and community teams. We then tried to have individual meetings with key stakeholder groups. This solved some of the scheduling challenges that we were having, but it proved to be inefficient and created some extra disparate meetings for the people that were planning the show, including myself. We were a few months in at this point, and the process had become cyclical, so people knew what to expect. And at this point, we were able to move the conversations to just emails, and that became sufficient. So the learning here was that individual planning paths for each segment of the show, coupled with big picture workback schedules and efforts, was the right balance. There were some benefits and even necessity to planning holistically, and having in-person conversations are always good, but the group planning process didn't work, nor was it really necessary. So we took a tiered approach to involving people, just starting with key folks and broadening that group over time. I'd like to share a sample workback schedule for the show. We'll typically start planning about 5 weeks out, where we'll begin with kickoff emails, as I mentioned, and we'll use that to identify the topics and news that we're going to cover on the show, as well as confirm the game content that we want to show off. When we're a month out, we'll take all of that information and begin putting that into a first pass of the run of show. We'll also identify pre-recorded content needs, as well as confirm guests that'll be on each segment. Once we're about 3 weeks out from the show, we'll be continuing to refine the run of show and start sharing that with a broader group of stakeholders for visibility. Once we're 2 weeks out, we're hoping to really begin finalizing things at that point. So the run of show will still have a few tweaks, but it should be in a pretty good place. We'll share that with all the stakeholders who need to have visibility into what's happening with the show, and we'll also begin creating graphics that you'll see on screen. Once we're 1 week out, everything should really be locked up at that point. We'll review all of the pre-recorded content, test the game content to make sure it's working as expected, and then we'll also do a table read of the run of show with everyone who's going to be on camera to get them comfortable with all of the content that we're going to be discussing and showing off. Now let's move into the next area where we've learned quite a bit. Iterative experimentation has a lot to it. The challenge that we had was building a show from scratch with minimal reference and developing best practices through trial and error. There were a few studios that had embraced live streaming as a communication mechanic when we first started thinking about it, and if they were doing it, it wasn't very frequently, and certainly not for multiple titles in a large franchise like Forza. So there was a lot of questions that we had to ask ourselves. First, we needed to think about what would be the right cadence for the show, making sure we had the right day and time for the show. We wanted to be cognizant of the fact that our top two audiences, the US and the UK, were in very different time zones. We wanted to think about how we would make the show informative, yet entertaining. We didn't want to get on camera and just read a set of release notes because that's not very fun to watch. We also wanted to think about how we're showcasing pre-release game content. There's some technical requirements to showing content that hasn't yet been pushed live. We wanted to think about what type of pre-recorded content is relative and plays well. If you think about your evening news show, an anchor will talk about a story and then usually have a pre-recorded piece that supports that. We really like that approach and wanted to use that on our show too. We wanted to think about how we're engaging with the community. As I had mentioned before, live streaming has a chance to open dialogue, and we wanted to make sure we're facilitating that two-way conversation with our community. There was also a chance to leverage our partners. We work with hundreds of car manufacturers, brands, and people. They each add value and context, and we wanted to make sure we were supporting that too. Finally, we wanted to think about how we would be effectively promoting the show, as well as what platforms and channels we should be streaming the show on. We needed to think about what methods would work best for our core audience and how we could leverage opportunities to expand our audience as well. One of the first things that we decided was to be outwardly honest and intend to not only learn, but implement improvements early and often. The live streaming space is in many ways inherently organic, and we wanted to just jump in. We wanted to try things and see what would work. It was interesting that our approach to live streaming paralleled what we were trying to do with game development moving forward, which was to be much more transparent about what we're doing and why. We wanted to embrace the rough edges and take calculated steps to successfully evolve. We started slow, trying not to do too much in the first few episodes, tempering expectations and being as prepared as possible, but also embracing the spirit of live streaming. It was meant to feel natural, and it was okay if everything wasn't perfect. We wanted to build a roadmap of show elements that we were comfortable growing over time. Again, we didn't want to accomplish everything in the first show. We wanted to start small and incrementally add and make adjustments and really carry forward a learning mentality. So the takeaway here was that beginning with tribal knowledge, all of the great processes that we've built up creating content over the years, we introduced new approaches and elements in small doses while considering community sentiment to better shape the show. We wanted to balance making each show as good as it could be, knowing that we would have a chance to reflect and improve after each show. We really looked at each show as a moment in time. We had post-mortem discussions afterwards to determine what we wanted to keep and what we wanted to change. So let's take a look at some of the specific show elements with which we experimented. The first area is graphics. We quickly realized that it might be difficult to follow along, especially for new viewers. We were streaming to multiple channels, Mixer, Twitch, and YouTube, and there was no way to really know in real time who is a returning viewer versus who is a new viewer, when people were coming or if they were going, if they were familiar with Forza or even a specific Forza title. So we began introducing additional elements to help navigate the show, such as a ticker bar, like the one you've seen at the bottom of some of these screens, as well as a show rundown schedule. We found that providing this context would really help inform and frame the show in a much more organized manner, so someone could join the show at any point and understand what they're watching. Another area where we experimented quite a bit is with pre-recorded content. It's always been a strength of the Forza franchise, but it needs to be used strategically in a live show. As I mentioned before, we've built up some great production processes, creative approaches, and ways that we execute this type of content. It works really well on its own, but it can't be used carelessly within a live show. We had to identify where we could insert this type of content to enhance the flow of the show. It had to work within the context of the entire run of show, and it needed to either inform, entertain, or support the viewing experience. If it was done ineffectively, it actually could have a negative effect and drive viewers away. We didn't want someone to start watching something, think we were going to a commercial break and then clicking away, because once they click away, it's very unlikely we'd be able to get them back. So we decided to use it to help set up segments as well as transition guests on and off camera. So we would use it to set up announcements like we did when we announced the new Forza Horizon 4 Eliminator mode a few months back, where we played an announced trailer and then came back to the guests on the couch and really had a deep dive on what the mode was. Or we'll sometimes use it to show things that we can't show live, such as a behind the scenes piece, or if we need to do a pre-recorded interview with someone who's unavailable for the show. And then it also provides a much cleaner look for swapping guests. So if we need to have a guest transition on and off camera, we'll play a pre-recorded piece, and while that's playing, we'll have the guest leave camera and bring on a new guest, so they're not walking across frame during the live show. Speaking of guests, that's another area where we've tinkered a bit. We've essentially had two different types of guests on the show. We've had key spokespeople and subject matter experts, and they each serve different purposes. A key spokesperson is really great for delivering more of a nuanced message, or maybe something that's strategic that requires some careful crafting, whereas a subject matter expert is best positioned to speak to the nuts and bolts of the new game content updates and features that are coming. It all goes back to our intention of trying to be more genuine and transparent with the community about what we're talking about. When we first started doing the show, we only had a few guests that were on for the duration of the entire show, but then we quickly evolved to a place where we had segment-specific guests to help maintain focus and relativity to the topics we were covering. We also found that the community responds best to the dev team members themselves. It maybe wasn't as obvious as it should have been initially, but unsurprisingly, we found that our viewers, and especially our core fans, really loved hearing from the dev team members directly because they're able to provide the most detailed, informative, and passionate context about what we're covering. If you think about a sports broadcast, you can have an analyst who's clearly knowledgeable and knows what they're talking about, but if that analyst happens to be a former player who has hands-on experience, their message just comes across that much more genuine and transparent, and that's what we were going for. The final area where we've experimented with quite a bit is community engagement. We know that forums and social media have their roles, but the live stream show is much more personable. Written word doesn't always properly convey the tone that you want, and it's also not quite as engaging. We know that live streaming facilitates more opportunities to speak with and to the Forza fans, and there's a lot of different things we've tried in this area. We've looked at live chat and spoken ad hoc to their questions and their comments. We've done pre-vetted Q&A where we've put out a call to action before the show, asked for questions, selected the ones that we want, and then spoken to those on the show. We've highlighted UGC, or user-generated content. We've done Skype interviews with community members, and we've even had community members live on the show. Each of these has their pro and con. So for example, speaking ad hoc to live chat is great. It's really interactive, but it also has some risk because we may be speaking or answering a question that we're not quite ready to answer yet. Whereas pre-vetted Q&A mitigates some of those risks, but it's also not quite as interactive. Finally, we want to make sure that we're continually reminding viewers that this show is for them. We want to hear from them. We want to hear their questions, their comments. We want them to talk to us. And we see this not as just a way to inform and entertain and engage, but also facilitate another community environment for them. One of the things that was surprising to us, but really, really cool to see, was that the viewers were talking to each other just as much as they were talking to us. And again, it was just another opportunity to foster another type of community environment for our fans. So these are just some of the bigger aspects and areas of the shows that we've tinkered with, and there's been a lot of thought and learning over the course of the show's existence. So let's take a look at where the show is at today. We're approaching the 2-year anniversary of the show's first episode. Forza Monthly premiered in June of 2018, and we haven't missed a beat since. It's also become the flagship show in the Forza programming lineup, complemented by 9 weekly shows, as well as Playground Games' monthly stream. We found that the community has come to expect this show to be the de facto way to learn about the latest updates in the world of Forza. We have a regular cadence for it, and just like any traditional TV show, we've essentially conditioned our viewers to tune in on a certain day and time each month. We've also seen that media outlets have looked to the show for news to report. This one's really huge for us. As the show has become more established, we've found that our big announcements and key talking points are getting picked up by both gaming and automotive press. It's essentially become a new type of press release for us. And finally, we continue to experiment, assess, and always strive to improve. So just like on day one, we still see this show as a living and breathing entity. And what might work for us today couldn't work for us tomorrow. And so we're always looking to evaluate and seeing how we can improve. To wrap this up, I'd like to share some proven guidelines that you can use. First, define objectives and continually ensure that your tactics map to them. I use this rule of thumb for all of the media and broadcast projects that I produce, and it certainly holds true here. Objectives are really important to define early on. You should build a repeatable process that works for you and your stakeholders and use it to guide the show development. I've talked about making adjustments and iterative experimentation, but having a stable and trusted planning process is really critical. Not only helps the show production, but it also helps build trust with your team and your stakeholders. Communication is absolutely essential during the planning stage. This is another one of those that seems obvious but still needs to be stated things because it does mitigate risks and surprises from the get-go. You should experiment and not be afraid to fail, but also learn from your mistakes. You'll hear this a lot in game development because it's true, and the show wouldn't be where it is today if we didn't take this approach. Try not to get caught up in the micro. The live streaming world is unpredictable, but it also has a long tail. Again, think of each show as a moment in time. Things are going to go wrong or not according to plan, and you'll need to make last-minute adjustments. It's just the nature of the beast. Have your postmortems, but don't dwell too long. Be ready to move on to the next show. Be honest but planful in your messaging. Your community and your viewers are going to know if you're not being truthful, but they will appreciate you being transparent. That said, winging it isn't a good strategy, especially if you have very nuanced messaging that you're trying to share. Viewing numbers can be a key performance indicator, but they're not necessarily an indicator of what is working on a show-to-show basis. So I didn't want to get too deep into the analytics side of things, and it's easy to get caught up on how many people are watching. To be honest, I always take a look at how many people are watching the show at any given time. And it is important to varying degrees, but it doesn't always paint the full picture. Which leads to the final point, which is pay attention to your viewer sentiment because real-time feedback is invaluable. For this type of show, listening to the community and your viewers is possibly the strongest indicator of what is and isn't working, not just for the show itself, but also the news that you're delivering, so you can take that back to your game development team. So today we've talked about the development and production of Forza Monthly, the considerations, the challenges, and the learnings that go into this show. I hope that it's provided you some inspiration and allows you to be successful with your live streaming initiatives. Thanks for tuning in.